Hi guys, today we're doing a focus shift shooting tutorial and it's real windy out here, so I'm going to do my best on the audio. And the objective today is to see how sharp of an image we can actually get. Now in order to do that, we're going to have to talk a little bit about aperture and what it is and how it affects our focus. The lower our aperture number actually is, the more wide open we have of a hole in our lens and an area to take in light. What that does is it creates a shallow or smaller area in our image that's in focus. It's a shallower depth of field. When we want more of our area in focus, what we do is stop down. We take our aperture and we take it to 14, 16, 22, and that gives us much more area in our image that is in focus. Before we start, I just want to touch on the idea of photography and it being an art. A lot of people use aperture as a tool, right, to help get their point across in their image. So I don't want to say every image you take should always be pen sharp or tack sharp. Every image we take shouldn't be tack sharp. We do this for the right scenario when we're shooting. I don't do this for every landscape, but when I do want something sharp, and when I want my foreground and my background and my mids all tack sharp, well, I can do focus shift shooting to do that. Now it's important to understand that with a focal plane and with depth of field, really we're just talking about acceptable focus. In other words, there's only really one focal plane, right? If I have an aperture of f6, well, there's one flat line here that's actually in focus. Even when we shoot like a landscape in f11, well, we've got one focal plane and everything after that plane and everything before that plane is in what we call acceptable focus. What focus shift shooting will do and what stacking will do is give us the ability to use the sharpest part of our lens, our sharpest aperture, and then be able to use that throughout the entire photo. Basically, it blows the roof off of the limitations that assigning an aperture will give us. All right, I'm going to keep talking through this because sometimes the wind actually does die down. Step one is getting battery in your camera. So immediately I'm going to go to live view because this is a lot easier in live view. Okay, I'm going to get level. So my composition for this isn't awesome, it's just okay. I'm just using this to show you folks how exactly we do the focus shift shooting. So in our foreground we have a dead Joshua tree. Right behind that in the early midground we've got a Joshua tree that's alive. And then deeper into the midground we've got some poles that outline a trail, some more trees, and then all the way in the back, way back in the background, we've got the red rocks. Now what we want to do is try and get all of this in focus, not using f11 or creating a big depth of field by stopping down our aperture, but by taking and using an aperture of say 5.6, which on this lens is its sharpest, and taking several shots, all focusing in different parts of the image as we go along. When we're done, we'll have several images, and each one will have a different focal plane. Now, we don't need focus shift shooting in our menu to do this. This is something anyone can do. Canon, Sony, you can manually focus and do this. So if you take the images yourself, that works fine too. So first thing I want to do is get level. I'm going to hurry up and shoot this while I've got the clouds. Now when I use the menu option in Nikon, I get a bunch of different options to go through. First thing it asks me is the number of shots. I always leave that on 20. That seems to be more than enough. Focus step width is actually how big of a jump should the camera go before it takes the next image and focuses for the next image. I usually set that on 2 or 3, and that works very well for me. Interval between next shot is how long until I should take the next shot. For some reason, maybe there's an application where you might want to wait before you take the next shot. I don't know what that would be. Exposure smoothing, and that is if there's changes in the light when the camera meters it, should it adjust for that, right? Should it keep the exposure the same if the sun dips behind a cloud? Silent photography, if you don't want to make a lot of click or clacker and you want to be very quiet, we can turn on that, but we're going to leave that alone. Storage folder, if we want to create a separate folder on our disk, we can do that. And I'm going to hit start. Ooh! Oh, my knees! Ooh! Oh, my Lord. 2, 3, 4. I heard 4 shots. Right? But, and here's the kicker. Here's why it didn't work. My aperture was set to 16. So that won't work. A 16th aperture is going to give you a full wide depth of field for a single image landscape shot. So when it goes to take a second and third and fourth shot, it says, hey, I don't have to. I'm already in focus. So what we do is stop to about 5.6, which is where I want to be. That's very sharp on this lens. All right, I'm at base ISO 64, and I'm moving my shutter now to 400th of a second, and that should give me a good exposure. Now, rather than focusing 1/3 of the way through the photo, right, because this is not one shot, I'm going to focus at the very bottom of my frame. That's going to be right here where these dead sticks start. Okay, so I've got focus at the very bottom of my frame. I'm going back to the focus shift shooting menu. Okay, we're going to run through this. Now that I'm focused at the bottom of my frame, I've got number of shots 20, step width between shots I've got set to 2. Interval until the next shot is 1 second. I've got exposure smoothing off. I've got silent photography off, and I'm not choosing a specific storage folder. I'll hunt around and find them on my own. So I'm going to jump up and hit start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ten shots. That is what I'm looking for. I need 10 different focal planes using f6 to be able to get this entire frame completely focused. It's always best to use a wide angle lens when you're doing something like this. This will give you the most amount of depth in your photo. So up close is a good term to keep synonymous with wide angle. If you're using your wide angle lens, you need to be up close to something so it can bleed its way into the image, right? I've got one main subject on this shot, and it's going to be this big dead branch in the front here. The other stuff's kind of important, obviously, but it's going to be less important than the dead branch. But all of it's going to be in focus because we took 10 shots of it, moving our focal plane down deeper, deeper, deeper into our shot each time. So I'm going to pack up, we're going to drive back to the lab, we'll open Adobe, and we'll get these suckers stacked. Okay, our takeaways for in the field are: 1, if you're going to take a single image landscape and we stop down to 11 or 14, well, you'll have more depth of field, more in focus, but none of it will be tack sharp. Okay, and 2, that anybody can do this. You don't need focus shift shooting as an option in your menu like Nikon. As long as you take your image and you focus throughout the depth of your image, maybe 5 or more times, we can take those images into Adobe or another third-party software like Helicon and stack them for sharpness.
Now, as I look at the 10 images on the right, taken by the D850 focus shift shooting, the further I go from left to right, the further you'll see the focus also appear deeper in the photo. Here we've got a focal line about near our living Joshua tree, and when I zoom in, you can see that we're in focus near the tree. The foreground element is out of focus, and so is the rear. Now as we get to the end of the line, we see that the mountains in the back are in focus, whereas the front, the foreground element, is not. So what we're going to do here is just pick one of these images, and we're going to make some very basic edits. I always like to start with auto, and we want to make sure the sky is not blowing out anywhere, none of the clouds. And so we'll pull back, and so we'll use our Alt button, hold that down while we drag the whites and make sure we don't see any white areas, and that tells us that we've hit our white point. And then we'll do the same for the blacks, holding down Alt. But blacks, I tend to personally like a little bit of black in my photo, so I'll leave some. contrast we'll deal with momentarily. We're going to add just a touch of clarity. There's no human skin tones in this photo, and we don't need to worry about the effect of clarity on human skin. Vibrance is basically saturation minus skin tones. So we're not going to use that. There are no skin tones, so we'll add a little bit of saturation. Okay, on to the tone curve. I'm going to use a default built-in option, a medium contrast, and it just adds a very light S-curve. Our HSL is hue, saturation, and luminance. I would like to see this sky a little bit more blue, but I'm worried about any of the shadowed areas getting blue also. When I turn up blue in my photo, notice how dark the mountains become. Notice when I slide the blue slider for saturation up, the mountains get dark also. This is a common problem with shadows and blue tints. Anytime we add blue to the shadows also. So we're going to attack this a different way. We'll get back to it. Under details, I already know the amount of sharpening I'm going to use in my settings, so I'll go ahead and apply them now. And I use the Alt key to mask out the sky or any smooth areas that I don't want sharpened. This is an important step that a lot of people miss when they sharpen. We don't want to sharpen flat textures. It's just going to create grain in our sky or any other area that's flat. Notice how I move the masking slider up so the sky is not part of the sharpening. This was shot at an ISO 64, and so luminance or noise reduction is not needed at all. Lens correction we will use. I was using the Tamron 15 to 30 first generation. Transform is not needed. We don't need to correct any verticals. And for vignetting, you know what they say is that if it's enough that you can see it, it's too much. So we want to go real light on the vignette, if at all. We do want to get to the blue sky, so I'm going to create a gradient filter. I'll hold the Shift key down when I do that, and that'll keep my gradient from bobbing left and right and keep everything nice and horizontal. Now from the top of my gradient line to the bottom of my gradient line, that's where the effect will fizzle out or fade out. So I'm going to put it right here about over the mountains where I want that extra blue I'm going to add to fade out. Okay, and I'm going to go to my color picker, and I'm going to pick blue, and I'm just going to move around until I find the color that I really want to use for the sky here. We want to choose an option for a brush, and this way we'll be able to brush in or brush out effects. Notice the darkness in the mountains that we talked about from adding of the blue. Well, here we can do an erase, and we use our brush tool in our gradient. We choose erase here at the bottom of our gradient options. And now, using a wide stroke with a lot of fall off, we can quickly brush the mountains and erase that darkening or blue effect that the mountains took on, where we really only wanted it in the sky. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of detail here, but I'm just going to quickly do this erase. Ordinarily, I'd zoom in and do a lot more detail, but the idea is that we use the fall off of the brush to kind of hide that there's any hard line there where the blue will stop. Notice how sharp the foreground is. We're selected our first image. The other 9 images are a different shade of gray. The lighter gray is where we'll take our settings from, and the darker gray are the images where we will apply the new settings. We're going to click the sync button, and that will bring up a new window that lets us choose which options we want to sync to the other 9 photos. The vignette we did, so I'm going to turn that on, and we're good. No spot removal, no crop, and synchronize. And as you can look on the bottom on our image line, you can see that all the settings that we applied to the first image are now applied to the other 9. We have a total of 10 images, all with the same edit. And if we choose all of the images at once that we want here and we right-click them, we can go to Edit and Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now, this might take a little bit of time. It depends on the power of your computer. I have an i7 with 32 gigs of memory in it and a 4 gig graphics card. It takes about 30 seconds for me to get all of my 10 layers loaded in Photoshop. We're going to use our Shift key and select all of the layers at the same time. We're going to go up to our Edit option and down to Auto Align Layers. Here are separate options for auto aligning. We just want to use the default auto and click OK. And what we're doing here is Photoshop's looking at each and every image and lining the pixels up. So if there's any discrepancy, if there was any camera movement from the wind or anything like that, Photoshop will realign these photos so that each one is directly on top of the other. Okay, it looks like the auto alignment is done, and you can see that Photoshop has moved the images very slightly. They were off a little bit, and you can see the edge behind the photos there in Photoshop. So step 2 is to make sure all our images are highlighted, and we're going to go back to Edit again, this time to Auto Blend Layers. And we have a panorama or we have stacked images. We choose stacked images and click OK. Okay, and so now Photoshop is looking at each of the 10 images, picking the sharpest pixels out of each and only using those for the photo. Now that it's done, you'll see that there is a mask that's been added to each of the layers. What we're going to do is turn off all of the layers so that we're not viewing anything. And then we'll turn them on one by one so you can see which pixels were chosen for each layer. Layer 1 looks like mostly the foreground. Layer 2, you'll see a little bit more deeper now into the photo where we focused a little deeper. Third layer, a little deeper again. Fourth and fifth, more of the photos being selected, all the way to the back where we're at our 10th image and the mountains come in. Now we have one image that is completely stacked and entirely in focus. We're going to zoom in here so you can take a look. Notice the sharpness in the foreground on the branches, and also notice the sharpness in the background on the rocks and the sky. There's no blurring from Aperture. It's only the sharpest pixels from all of the 10 images. Now, Photoshop doesn't always get it right. Sometimes it makes small mistakes, especially if there's moving grass or wind. But these masks here that are on each layer are fully editable. So I can use a black brush or a white brush to edit these masks and choose the pixels I want to use for myself.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me. This is actually my very first tutorial on my 3rd video ever on YouTube. So I hope you guys support me. Like and subscribe. Please comment. I want to have some discussion around this, help you answer any questions you might have. So feel free to do those things, and we'll absolutely see you on the next tutorial.